All right, welcome everyone to Comedians and Elevators podcast. I've got my guest Lucas here, and Lucas, please tell us about yourself.
Hey, what's going on? Thanks for having me. First off, this is going to be a lot of fun. Yeah, I'm just kind of an all-around comedy performance type of guy. I've spent many years working in comedy clubs, so as a consequence of that, I found myself on the stage cracking a few jokes here and there. But nowadays, I'm mostly an actor and a comedy writer, having spent a lot of time training in Chicago at their more illustrious comedy houses, and then kind of following the indie actor route. I'm getting ready to go shoot what is actually a sequel indie film to one I shot a few years ago with a wonderful group down in Austin. It's called The Holocaust Swan. It's like a World War II bioepic, not particularly comedy packed, but a really interesting project, a interesting look at a specific region in Egypt and some pretty fun stuff. Or well, not fun. That's not a good way to look at war, but a pretty epic couple of things that happened in that area around that time. So
Very
I'm
cool. Well,
looking forward.
action comedy should be funny, right? So if you got
Yeah, it
war,
should be. It should be. Not
but it's not a
everybody really
comedy.
thinks of World War II and gets a big comedic kick out of it,
Yeah,
but yeah, it's more of a drama for sure.
awesome. Very cool. You said in Egypt, is it around the pyramids or elsewhere?
It's in the Aswan region of Egypt. I'm not entirely sure right off my top of my head where that's at
Okay,
in Egypt. I looked one time a few years ago, and it went in one ear and right out the other.
got it,
Kind
got
of
it.
the actor's life when you're pounding scenes, memorizing bit by bit. Once it's done, it's done. You move on to the next part.
Of course, of course. Everyone's got to do their part.
Yeah.
So, so the main topic of Comedians and Elevators podcast is the idea of the comic versus the comedian. And so, a quick definition is a comedian is a funny person as a character, and a comic is a person that tells funny jokes. Obviously, there are two sides of the same coin. Everyone is leaning, everyone has both parts. You need to be both, but some lean more towards one than the other. So, which do you think you're more, if either?
I'm probably more of a comedian, just in function, just in how people might experience me now and experience me in any work for sure.
Okay, you say in function, do you mean like by your intent or by the results?
Probably by the intent. I would think
Okay,
a comic is really results driven, especially because a lot of that to me sounds like immediate gratification.
got it. I
Whereas,
mean, I would agree. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, whereas the comedian has a different approach to like the long form laugh. How
Okay,
do you how do you really instill something as being regularly funny over a long period of time?
interesting. That's yeah. So yeah, I mean, got to dive a little deeper into that, but that's definitely kind of leading to the first main question I have is basically the role or persona in comedy. So the first question is how much of the comedian's voice is a character versus their real self?
Um, There's probably lots of voices after you've been a comedian for a little bit. They have a tendency to kind of go in many different directions, especially given that you're really just tying it into any emotional experience. There's happy comedy and sad comedy and
Hmm.
angry comedy for sure. So yeah, I think the comic is interested in starting up a conversation with a very specific audience very quickly.
Okay,
And the comedian gets their audience by default. It's just
because
whoever happened to have been around.
I see. So is that alluding to? I'm not sure how to parse that. So you're saying maybe the venue, the comedian has like fans that come see him, and then the comic just picks apart whatever's available.
I think the comedian really relies on surprise to get a laugh. You may not
Okay,
have expected me to be funny, but the comic is expected to be funny.
I see. Okay, so the comedian by definition could surprise you that they even exist, even though they're standing on stage for stand up.
Yeah, well, what does a comedian physically look like?
Of course, yeah, you
Yeah,
can't
you got to
tell.
really get to that experience, to that surprise. Like I didn't actually know you were about to be funny.
So have you experienced that on stage? I mean, I would think anyone that goes on stage doing stand up, you expect to be funny, right?
Yeah, but not everybody knows how you're going to be funny.
Right.
And sometimes you get that in the riff and the improvised moments. Sometimes just the energy of a room, spontaneity happens.
Hmm.
Uh,
So
sometimes a comedian's just funny in how they react to how their audience is reacting.
yeah, of course, absolutely. Well, would you say that basically authenticity matters, or is the illusion part of the magic?
I think emotional authenticity matters. I don't think anything else does, though.
Okay,
The
emotional
intention behind
authentic.
it, the settings, any blocking or any writing really doesn't matter, but the emotional authenticity is pretty important.
So, so that can be tricky if you're trying to do like the same joke over and over again, and it has an emotional component. It was authentic, hopefully the first time. So repeating it, do you think there's a kind of a problem or a pitfall with that repetition?
Well, that's the performer's chore, you
Right.
know. Um, Patton Oswalt, huge, very famous comedian, has an extremely famous special where he details his wife dying. Very emotional, very heavy content, but it is comedy. He gets laughs, pow, 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 one after the other. And it's authentic, so it isn't cruel or it isn't tacky or misplaced because you're talking about the death of his spouse. So
Yeah, I could see that go very wrong. I haven't seen it, but I can imagine that going very
it's
wrong.
worth a watch, especially if you're looking for how can a comedian be funny in an extremely tragic situation
Yeah.
and it go really well.
Wow. Yeah. And has he done it more than once?
I know he did that tour for a
Okay.
while.
With
The
with
special
that
itself, I don't
piece.
know. I only know of one recording of the special, but he toured
Okay.
that joke for a long time. Yeah.
Well, that's the hard part is to do
Mhm.
that. That's actually really hard. Well, that comes up to the second question, punching up versus punching down. Where do comics versus comedians stand on this?
Um, I think that's great. So it's like, did you do it intentionally or not? Punching up is probably typically intentional to give a compliment, but through a joke. Devilishly handsome. Where you're being tied into something inherently evil, but it's so intense that you're so it's complimentary. Whereas punching down is uh I think I saw a meme the other day of it still baffles me that there's a giant island of waste just floating around in the sea, and they said you don't have to talk about England like that or something. That's punching down. That's like you didn't have to involve them in that. They didn't
It's
come into this
interesting.
equation. But sometimes it's like, who's your audience? Because an
Yeah.
audience will definitely inform if you're allowed to punch down on this person or this topic, especially nowadays.
Yeah,
You
nowadays, I mean, this is a kind of a new idea even in comedy, I think, in the last few years that it's even relevant, right? I'm even asking this question, right? It wasn't like that 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So,
Yeah, there was a lot more formality, it seemed, in the experience, especially like in a stand-up comic. It was almost like a business professional item not to punch down. But now there's a lot of attention and a lot of likes and a lot of views on punching down, so long as you're punching down on the right person.
do you think that's a
And
result of all this online activity? Is that now
yeah,
that's kind of like we need to shock value?
I think it's everybody kind of forming these hate groups that are not specifically themed,
Mm.
but oh, you and I somebody similarly, we have a dislike of a performer or of a concept or of a structure, and we found each other online because there's a search bar, and now we've kind of dictated to somebody, if you want to punch down in this area, we will laugh, we will appreciate that.
So let me throw an idea. It just popped in my head is punching down on incels. Does that even make sense?
Well, I've always felt bad for the incel. It seems like they live a rather tortured life,
Right.
tortured
Well,
existence. You want to say it's a bit self-imposed, but sometimes you look at somebody and you're like, they just didn't stand a chance. And maybe that's me punching down on them right there.
right. That's why I just do it out. I haven't actually heard one. I haven't heard a joke anyone do that before. So seeing if
Yeah, it's,
where that lands.
it's unfortunate that in the popular zeitgeist, especially of the incel, is nobody's too impressed with them and nobody appreciates their input because they're not able, literally, they're not able to get the one thing that defines them as an incel. And,
Right.
you know, it's sad, but it's like, well, as soon as somebody else starts snapping and getting nasty, you feel less and less bad for them.
Interesting. Okay. Well, let's see. Maybe they'll go somewhere. I'll give it a shot later.
And
Let's.
best of luck to the incels.
Yeah. Best of luck. That's the way to end that one. So let's go to number three. Cultural translation of comedy. How do jokes work in one area of the country, and not in another?
How do jokes work in one end of the country and not in another? Well, there's like the local nomenclature. Like I live in Texas. I'm from the South.
Okay.
The Southern accent and experience is unique from that of the Bronx or that of living in Los Angeles or living in Canada. Um, and one thing I think, especially the English language, really allows us to do is say three different things, but with one sentence. We have a lot of subtext. We have a lot of culturally informed indication, or I can't think of a better word for it though, but you ever share a joke with somebody simply by making eye contact with them at the right time?
Only if you're referring to a third thing.
Right. Like just today I had a big meeting at work full of a bunch of managers and whatnot, and it's always a big top dog manager or director who's giving a talk to a lot of us. And as they say things and we hear the things and they're kind of in a large structure, you're like, oh, I wasn't expecting that. And then you cut your eyes over to somebody and you realize you've shared an experience. And that eye contact is almost a joke.
So I can picture that they're maybe not a part of the group in some way, like they're not from the South, and but now they're in the South, so they don't actually know some of the nomenclature.
Right. I'm from a small town where many people drive around these large tank-sized pickup trucks.
And wave to everybody so that no
Com-
one shoots at each other.
Right, completely off the ground. You need a ladder to step into them. They're covered in chrome and audacious colors. If you're not a part of that culture, you're probably not going to get a lot of the humor surrounding it.
I could see that. I could
Yeah.
see that. That does. I was in the army, so I did experience a lot of that, and I
The
kind of grew
military,
into it.
I've known a couple people in the military, y'all develop your own language based on your own experiences.
Right. Yeah. It's forced. You're kind of, yeah. You don't necessarily like it, but you definitely, it sticks
hmm
with you. So
hmm
it's not always funny though. It's hard to kind of turn it into something comical. But I always try. Should we go to number four? So crowd work versus crafted work. So do you think that the comic riffs more and a comedian performs? And is there a sweet spot?
I definitely think the comedian is more performance based.
Okay.
Um, riffing is a really tricky thing for a performer because
Mhm.
not only do you need to have the right audience for it, you need to be really properly prepared for that audience because if you can't riff with them, it can lead to really awkward moments and experiences because not only did they like, let's say they paid money to come sit down, maybe they bought a drink or something and you're supposed to be funny, but now you have tasked them with partnering with you on making something funny and it didn't work out.
Right.
That's pretty sad. It's like I didn't want to come here and be a part of the show and the show it wasn't even funny.
Yeah.
It was
I
funny if
see.
it worked, that was maybe one thing, but if you're making me talk to you and I'm not enjoying the experience, I probably would have rather you did your own thing and I just watched.
That's one hell of a point. So basically, that's where the comic, I would think the comic fits in because they need to always have material. They usually have more material, at least just jokes
Mhm.
they can throw out there, and so hopefully something would stick at that point, right?
Yeah, the comic, they definitely need to know where they're at because that's going to inform a lot of themselves. Whereas the comedian who practices a performance and instills a craft into it, they're kind of going for something that's a bit more universal. So the space they're in isn't as consequential to their performance.
Because it's about them,
Right, because it's about them. It's not really about that I'm in a really red area in the South or a particularly blue place in the Western region or somewhere like that. I'm so much of a performance that it's about me.
right?
I think I think Kevin Hart's that way.
I would
Kevin
agree.
Hart
I
can
would say
be
that any most comedian you can name, really, everyone knows, or any comic verse comedian, they're a comedian because you can name, right? And you can almost
Mhm.
pick out exactly what it is about them. So with Kevin Hart, would you say that maybe it's that he's in pain and his whole agenda is to make you understand his pain?
I don't think he's in pain anymore. I think early on he was in pain, but I think
I
now
mean, his character.
his message,
Yeah.
yeah, a lot of it is his reactions to things. That's kind of his approach, right? It's a lot of it's kind of typical family-based stuff. He talks about just dealing with his business stuff and some observations, but it's kind of at his expense because he puts a little bit intentionally, not he puts a little bit of his like he recognizes ignorance in a situation.
Okay.
I messed up with my kids. I messed up with my wife. I went outside to do this. I tried to do it this way. I didn't realize this. It happened that way.
That's a good read on it. Yeah.
Themes like that.
That's what everyone should be doing. All comedians should be doing that, but somehow
Well, if
that's
they
not
want to
what's
make
happening.
Kevin Hart money, that's for sure.
That's the way to do it. Let's look. So number let's see, censorship and offense. So here's a good one. Does a comic avoid offense while a comedian courts it to prove a point?
I don't know.
Right.
I don't think anybody has quite cracked that egg yet because a lot of people are being offensive on purpose and getting a consequence they thought they could dodge. A lot of people are being offensive on accident and they're
Yep.
getting a consequence they weren't expecting. A lot of people can be as offensive as you think somebody can be, but because of perhaps their brand or their approach, or there's just their place in it all, they're able to get away with it. Dave Chappelle's probably the biggest example of that that I can think of.
Yeah.
For a while, Louis C.K. was really like that until too much truth, too many things ended up being true, and he very much lost the ability to pull that off.
So I've heard many people call this Louis C.K. A comic more, and so the question is, which do you think survives better in a cancel culture environment?
The comic, easy.
The comic. So, okay, easy. So the comic being the one that's so Louis C.K., would you consider him a comic?
Yeah, I think so because I think what he does simply relies on his voice and a microphone, whereas a
Okay,
comedian, they have to invite other aspects in.
okay,
And because that those aspects come in the form typically of somebody else pulling off some labor to pull it off, you're more likely to lose all of that. Whereas if it's just you, you can weather the storm, but somebody else might say, I'm going to back away from this shtick and let you go off and do your thing.
interesting, interesting. Um, I, I think maybe you might be changing the definition that I put the definition as a comedian is a funny person and a comic is a person that tells funny jokes. Is that
Okay.
still what you think it is?
I guess I'm seeing the comedian, at least how comedians are, as being a lot of scripting.
Yeah, but
And to
also the
me,
comic has written jokes, right?
yes, but their writing might come in the forms of bullet points and this plus this equals that.
Right.
Whereas, at least in my experience, or at least knowing how some of the working comedians how they operate, there's a lot more paperwork. Even if they're an individual, there's a lot more. I have to do this way. I have to define a space this way. Um, it requires style and design, even if there's not a literal element of that, because sometimes design is simply how do I look to you? There's a lot of comics, especially very blue comics, people who are, they're going to go out there and say that joke that really goes over the line.
Right.
They've given up all of those other aspects in order to get to that joke.
Got it. So really, okay, I would tend to. I don't see it that often, but yeah, they're basically just trying to. They're almost like invisible in a sense, anonymous perhaps. Like I'm
Mhm.
going to be that guy that pushes the line, and that's what people are going to remember, but not me.
Mhm.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I
It's
think,
just it's just a thought.
yeah, I think when I think of like comics like Rodney Dangerfield, very performance bound,
Okay.
extremely clean cut, extremely sharp jokes. Everything has an exact timing to it. His look has an exact timing to it. The way he would open his eyes and move his mouth around, that was choreographed and really
Yeah.
intentional. Whereas sometimes you got a comic who's just some raggedy old person who didn't care how they dressed today. They don't care if they're drunk or not. They don't care who's in the room. This is my joke. Here's how it goes.
I
If
would
that
agree
makes
with that.
sense.
So 100%. So would you think it, so timing versus delivery, would you say it's, it's more science or art?
Art.
More of
I,
an art than a
I think
science? Okay.
anybody, just people, sometimes people, if they're trying to be funny or if they're trying to be like a comedy leader or something, they make the mistake of falling into a science or a scientific approach or a breakdown or a rubric or a, you know, opening plus middle equals punchline type of approach. And they box themselves in and they take the magic out of a situation with that approach.
What do you mean by comedy leader?
Some people are in it to be thought leaders and they just happen to be comics. They want to
Okay.
push an idea and that's how you end up with the comedian who gives you a worthwhile experience, but maybe it wasn't full of laughs.
Okay. Okay. I could see that. All right. Well, that kind of ties into the next one is laughter versus applause. Are comics chasing laughs and comedians chasing applause breaks that validate their message?
Personally, if you're not chasing laughs, I don't know why you would say anything's comic or call yourself either a comic or a comedian.
Sure.
Um, Chasing claps is philosophy. It's political. It's making a big cultural celebration, which isn't a bad thing, but it's not typically what you bought your ticket for.
Is there any comedian that you can think of that does this?
Yeah, it's a negative thing though, so I don't want to name anybody.
Okay, I see. So you're saying, I see.
But
So
I
you're
mean,
saying,
sometimes there's just people, yeah, who down in the South, we drive big old trucks, woohoo, and the audience they go ballistic, and it's true, and the audience might like it and all
right,
of that, but that's not really comedy because you can do that anywhere else and they won't call it comedy.
right.
So why should it count as comedy there?
That's a good point. That so yeah, their applause. It's really more kind of a super narcissistic experience more than anything else, right? Everyone's just kind of getting on the same boat.
Hmm.
I would say yes on that. So then comedy is commentary. So when does a comedian cross into being a philosopher preacher? And you're saying that's basically at that point. So would it be good to dilute? Would when they're doing that, is that diluting their humor?
I think they just need to make a really intentional choice of whether they're doing this to get a laugh or doing this to get a point across.
Okay. Well, that
Because
would be
I kind of like the old school notion that comedy is the art of criticism.
okay.
And not to be a big historical nerd about it or anything like that, but when you look at the jester and his place in the court, it was really to dress ridiculously, act ridiculously, and say things that were so profoundly true that they had to elicit a laugh, and they had to come from somebody so ridiculous that you wouldn't feel so greatly offended by it.
Right. That's 100% true. I don't know. I mean, your commedia dell'arte is what you're referring to generally. Would you say?
Yeah, yeah, it definitely was born out of that root.
Yeah, definitely. That's one way not to get your head cut off for sure. Right. Is it so? But
Yeah.
now that we're pushing that, with punching down, for example, and trying to, be with that shock value, you kind of lose the criticism a little bit. Right.
I mean, you could. That's what I'm saying is like it's so circumstantial and
Right.
such an unguided and undefined art that, you know, you could punch down and it'd be considered fair criticism by a group or one person at least.
Would you think that maybe at that point I would say the comic is hiding behind their jokes?
Oh yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
definitely.
And the comedian is exposing themselves even though it's all about them, right? They're even though they could be drunk or this, it's really more, you know, it's not really when we say they're not hiding even though it's consistent.
No, I don't think they're hiding. Um, I think the comic has to hide a bit behind a joke because when you make a life out of criticizing others, at some point you might have to admit you're a bit of a cynic. And being a cynic in a room of other people can be a bit difficult, especially if you're trying to actually befriend everyone. So in order to remain in the room, in order to at least get some viable form of respect, I need to translate my message via a joke.
You think that's what either comedian or comics are trying to befriend? Is that their goal?
I think a comic is trying to befriend the audience. Definitely. I think the comedian is a lot more they're bound by narcissism, kind of like we mentioned earlier. Because it's not about the audience. It's about me being so great at a craft that regardless of who you are, you're going to laugh. Whereas sometimes the comic, they have to establish a lot of trust. They've got to I have to assure you that I'm not a bad person before I start telling you all these jokes about my history of being not a bad person or not a good person.
That's interesting. So in one respect, the comic, the one that's just telling the jokes, has a higher bar sooner.
Yeah, I guess you could view it that way. I think they have a greater need to make sure they've got some defense put up.
To tell the joke they're
I think
about to
that
tell.
I think the comedian gets to lie a little bit more, but because their performance is so crafted, they can get away with it a bit. Whereas the comic needs to lean further into that emotional authenticity, and they have to establish a lot of trust before they really start telling you the truth, even if it's going to make you laugh. Or if they don't, it won't make you laugh.
Would you say that maybe the that the comedian should start his set as a comic to get that instant or attempt to get build some trust there, and then move into what is his real character about?
Not necessarily. I like a lot of mystique. I like a
Okay,
mystery. I like an unexplained beginning.
okay.
Because then the surprise of the performance really comes in handy.
Could be
But that
distracting if you do what the way I'm suggesting is you hit him with a kind of comic style at the beginning and then it evolves into a comedian.
yeah. Yeah, well the comedian kind of says, "Look at me," and the comic comes in and says, "Well, look at you." Right?
Interesting. Yeah, that's I mean you're definitely being very poignant about it. And I'm thinking of a couple points here written down that it's a different perspective. I mean, generally, I would say they're two sides of the same coin, and so there's kind of a balancing act there. So you flip and you see one and the other, and they go from between. But that's an interesting. I'm gonna have to chew on that one a little bit. But that brings us to the last question, number 10, legacy. Who's gonna get remembered? Will the comics Type 5 survive time, or will the comedian's cultural point of view be more timeless?
Probably that the comedian's point of view will be more timeless, but I don't think they win by much.
Okay.
There are some jokes that are just pure masterpieces. Some individual comics have their joke that just resonated and hit hardcore. But a lot of people are going to have their persona. Like Bernie Mac is probably better remembered because of his character and because of the effect he gave, the way he dressed, the way he acted and moved, and all of that. Whereas George Carlin is probably remembered for specific jokes.
So you'd say George Carlin's more of a cop.
Yeah. Yeah, Bernie Mac had a very curated performance style, and it was great. It was obviously, he was a phenomenal historic comic, comedian, stand-up comic, and actor.
100%. I think that's the great place to end. Do you have anywhere you'd like everyone to find you online?
I just put it in the Google and see what pops up.
Okay, that's one way to do it for
Yeah.
sure. Well, Lucas, thank you so much for being my guest. And everyone, if they could like and subscribe and get the viewer count up, and so have more guests like Lucas on the show. And hopefully, we'll do this again in the future.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Keenan.
All right, Lucas, thank you so much. And everyone, we'll see you on the next Comedians and Elevators podcast.